Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today, carrying on with the International Booker Prize long list for this year, I have got Gabriela Wiener's Undiscovered, translated by Julia Sanches, who also actually translated Boulder and a few other sort of books by the same author. So yeah, just kind of really interesting to kind of get into this. I'm going to talk about some spoilers as we go in the book, but the first section of this review will be spoiler-free as much as I can. So feel free to log off if you need to at that point. But yeah, if not, let's get started on this book. So let's get started with this book. We learn quite early that the book Undiscovered refers to a few other things, and it doesn't really sit neatly into fiction. Although it's on a long list for a prize that is about fiction, that hasn't really stopped the International Booker before. We've sort of seen books like The Years by Annie Ernaux make the long list, despite being sort of more non-fiction in some ways than fiction. And this book is kind of no real exception to that. It sort of sits between fiction, non-fiction, auto-fiction, somewhere in that. And a large part of this book, and especially as we find out quite early on, is Gabriela Wiener looking over her family's history, and particularly the history of sort of various people in her family who were responsible for essentially taking artifacts from other countries and displaying them. So actually, whereas some of the family wealth or some of the family renown might come from that, it actually sort of complicates factors when we get into what that means for the wider family. So her surname automatically, Wiener, particularly because it's a surname that you don't see as typically in South America, and she's in Peru. What we typically find in this book then is that the story kind of is her trying to square that off with the idea that this sort of relative of hers has become famous for having taken these artifacts away from the country and displaying them somewhere else. And actually, she herself now has to contend with the fact that as a Peruvian woman, she is sort of both a person affected by it personally because it's in her family, but also a person who would be angry at it because it's sort of something that's been taken from a culture that she belongs to. And so it's this really complicated sort of thing from there that leads off. And I think those are sort of some of the really interesting discussions in this book, for me personally, of how you reconcile a family history with who you are now. And this is sort of something that comes up a lot in memoirs of other people, you know, who are related to these big historical figures. And although Gabriela Wiener's relative is not quite as famous, perhaps outside of Peru or outside of certain circles, there's still some sort of sense to which that hangs over her. The book is kind of an interesting one in the sense that it has quite a few different focus points. So that's one major topic of the book is that kind of thing around family and colonialism and various other things. And particularly there are these conversations that keep coming up in the book about how it's seen as better if you're dating someone from a certain place, particularly from Spain or from all these other things. And this sort of comes up in a big way in the book. But then some other parts of this book kind of sit alongside this in kind of an interesting and slightly odd way, sometimes to my mind. There's a sort of discussion about something that she goes to, a sort of group she goes to, sort of about decolonizing your desire. And in that, she is sort of meeting with all these people who are talking about relationships where particularly one part or some part of the relationship is with white people and sort of the complications that can come for sort of a non-white person in that relationship. Particularly the conversations around sort of what that means about desire and how people look and the beauty standards that they're expected to conform to, or the relationship sort of types that they're expected to conform to. And our, you know, well, Gabriela, whether as the narrator or as the writer here, because there may sometimes be a bit of a difference, I wonder, in this book, talks about her polyamorous relationship and talks about being in a relationship with a woman and a man at the same time. And sort of her feelings of isolation and of power within that as well. And so it's kind of interesting because those two things are kind of connected by that thread of colonialism in the book. I will also say at times it feels a little bit random because there will be moments, at least for me personally, where we suddenly switch from one topic to the next. And sometimes it feels a little bit, I don't know, sometimes it feels a little bit like I'm listening in as somebody is in a therapy session. And sometimes that can be great in a book. Sometimes that's really fantastic and vulnerable and kind of allows you access to this really sort of, this beautiful moment of what someone's going through. I think in this book, it kind of just sits a bit randomly. I wonder as well if part of my feeling about this is because it's billed as fiction. Whereas I think if this was a non-fiction book, I think I'd enjoy it maybe more for what it is. Whereas I think maybe the fact that I'm reading it as part of a fiction prize makes me sort of wonder, almost need more of a narrative through line between some of these things. I don't know. I mean, either way, I think she writes really compellingly about relationships and about colonialism and about various other things. And particularly the sort of thread about her family history, I think is really interesting in the book. I did occasionally just find that it sort of veered off on these slightly unexpected tangents in a way that sometimes was interesting and sometimes felt a bit maybe navel gazing for my likes. I don't know. I may be being harsh here, but that's sort of how I was feeling around parts of it. And there are some other bits I want to get into without, but that will involve spoilers. So I will go into that in just a second. But if you do need to log off before I go into spoilers, that's absolutely fine. I think overall, I think there's some really compelling and interesting arguments and thoughts in this book. I just don't, sort of at times it left me wanting a little bit more. I mean, it's a relatively short book. And I sometimes feel like maybe more of a through line would have helped me a bit more. But also I don't know, again, if that's just because I'm approaching this as fiction rather than non-fiction, and that can sometimes change how you feel about those things. Anyway, let's go on to some spoilers. And if you do need to hop off here, feel absolutely free. Take care, and let's go on to some spoilers. So the two main parts that I want to talk about in terms of spoilers, and I feel do affect how I view the book to some degree, are a little bit about both of those key themes. One about her father, about her sort of, about the sort of family member, and another about her relationship. So let's start with the relationship. She starts towards the end to see that relationship breaking down, which throws up some interesting things about this group she's going to, because she sort of wants to sort of almost say, well, my relationship's failing, but not because it's a polyamorous relationship, and not because one of the members of the relationship is white, but because of all these other ways in which I feel broken, or in which I feel like I'm unable to participate fully. And I thought some parts of that were really interesting. But it also did sort of leave this sort of like slightly odd thing for me of sort of, well, what was sort of the point in some of these discussions? Or, you know, we've kind of talked around so many parts of this. And there is a really beautiful scene, I think. I say beautiful, it's kind of a heartbreaking one in many ways, where she is feeling incredibly alone and isolated. And she basically finds herself essentially masturbating, but between both of her partners, like sort of laying in between both of her partners, feeling utterly alone, knowing that if she were to reach out and touch one of them, that could be some kind of connection, but that doesn't happen. She sort of just stays there alone. And I thought that was really interesting and profound, and sort of in how it looked at that kind of sense of loneliness, even when, you know, everyone around her is almost telling her that by being part of a polyamorous relationship, there's almost twice the love for her. But actually she feels more alone maybe than ever. And I thought that was quite well handled. But then I think the thing I struggled with after that is sort of that in connection with the final part of this book, where towards the end we suddenly get a very sort of brief couple of moments in the book that seem to suggest potentially that the person she thinks she's related to isn't someone she's related to, that maybe she was adopted. And maybe because of the lack of narrative through line sometimes in other ways, for me at least personally, that came a little bit out of left field and made it feel a little bit more like a thing thrown in at the end that actually needed its own thought process, or needed its own moment of discovery. I kind of wanted her to sit with it a little bit longer and really think about what that would mean. How does everything else that she's discussed in the book change if that's the case? And I think it felt almost a bit throwaway for me, and it made it a little bit more of a complicated ending to this book, where for all of the other parts that I thought were really interesting, it kind of meant, well, all this discussion that we've had about this figure whose presence has loomed so large over her life because of this family name, well, what does it now mean for her if she's freed of that to some degree? Is she going to change her name? Is she going to do these other things? And so it almost felt like it kind of ended on this cliffhanger that wasn't really a cliffhanger, and sort of ended a bit kind of, yeah, just sort of ended there. And I kind of almost wanted her to explore it so much. We'd had so much in the rest of the book of her really going into depth about all of her thoughts on everything else. And it seems quite strange to sort of leave that hanging without a further discussion on what she might think or feel about it. So yeah, that's sort of a kind of complicated set of feelings about this book. I still do think a lot of it is really interesting and really engaging. I think there were just some parts that didn't fully land for me. And so this felt like a slightly odd book because it sort of felt like sporadic thoughts more than a kind of narrative through line. And that can be fine. But here, I think I struggled with really piecing that together. Maybe, I don't know, maybe sort of sitting on this a little bit longer, I'll come to appreciate some more parts of that. Because I do think there's something quite bold and interesting about leaving those things half done and half acknowledged or half approached. You know, leaving, not having to tidy everything up with a ribbon, because sometimes things can't be tied up that way. So yeah, really interesting in that sense. But I have some odd mixed feelings, and I'd really love to hear other people's thoughts. So if you've read this, please do let me know your thoughts. Try and keep it as spoiler-free in the comments as you can. It's kind of a difficult book for that because so much of the discussion, I think, is about this end part of this book. But yeah, would love to hear your thoughts. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.